The government shutdown isn't a threat anymore. It's here, and the machinery of the economy is grinding against itself. Across the country, agencies are shuttered, paychecks are frozen, and contracts are suspended. Those aren't just bureaucratic inconveniences, they're structural fractures running through employment, production, and consumption. The real question isn't how long this disruption lasts. It's whether this kind of paralysis is becoming permanent. Because if it is, we aren't just dealing with a pause in spending. We're watching the slow erosion of economic resilience. To see where this goes, we need to unpack what a shutdown actually breaks. When the federal government shuts down, the first thing that halts is payroll. More than 2 million civilian employees either work without pay or are furloughed. That's everything from air traffic controllers and forest rangers to laboratory analysts at the Food and Drug Administration. The instant those paychecks freeze, local economies lose oxygen. Grocery stores near military bases see sales drop double digits. Childcare centers, especially those near government facilities, start trimming hours. It's not theoretical. It's visible in every community dependent on federal activity. Then come the grants. Research funding, municipal aid, education, transfers, anything not classified as essential is suspended. Construction projects stop midstream, equipment sits idle, and small contractors with thin credit lines face liquidity squeezes. Each halted project represents weeks of unbilled labor and delayed income. It's the micro version of GDP contraction in motion. In prior shutdowns, that hit has run at roughly 2% of GDP per week. That means 1 month of paralysis can erase tens of billions in output, permitting and approvals next. Every pending Small Business Administration loan, every housing permit dependent on federal review stuck in limbo. Startups that counted on SBA backing suddenly face frozen plans, while municipalities can't issue bonds for federally tied infrastructure. It's not just missed activity. It's lost momentum as businesses postpone hiring, suppliers cancel orders, and banks tighten underwriting standards on anything exposed to government contracts. There's another less visible casualty: data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, and the Department of Commerce suspend routine releases, jobs reports, consumer price data, trade statistics. Without those updates, markets trade blind. Investors can't see shifts in inflation or employment trends. When the indicators disappear, volatility rises because pricing becomes guesswork. The cost of capital drifts upward as uncertainty replaces information. Financial markets need steady inputs to calibrate risk. When those inputs vanish, they misprice almost everything: bonds, currencies, equities. And mispricing compounds the economic drag. Traders overreact. Policy analysts lose reference points, and businesses delay decisions. That's why shutdowns don't just stop government. They interrupt the entire system of expectations. Take housing as a small but telling example. The Department of Housing and Urban Development halts processing for certain loans. The USDA freezes rural housing guarantees. The SBA stops backing small business property loans. New construction slows. Commercial developers wait on licenses and environmental reviews that no one can sign off. It's a standstill that ripples outward through lumber yards, trucking firms, and local tax bases. All of these effects pay freezes, halted data. Suspended permits are costly, but they're still symptoms of something deeper. The real cost isn't simply what stops. It's what this shutdown exposes about how fragile the machinery of government funding has become. This shutdown isn't an accident of timing or ideology. It's the result of structural political stagnation. What used to be an emergency has turned into a recurring feature of governance. Congress operates less through full appropriations and more through stopgap continuing resolutions, temporary agreements that carry forward old budgets while new ones stall. That's governance by autopilot. And autopilot eventually crashes when the controls seize up. Each continuing resolution papers over disagreement without fixing underlying priorities. Agencies start to function like undercapitalized firms, scraping through short-term renewals instead of long-term investment. Planning a 5-year research initiative or energy project becomes impossible when funding windows shrink to 6 months. The erosion isn't visible day to day, but it's mechanical. Systems built for stability now survive on emergency improvisation. What makes that dangerous is accumulated fragility. The longer agencies rely on temporary allocations, the less capacity they have to absorb shocks. Deferred maintenance piles up. IT upgrades stall. Contract continuity disappears. In corporate terms, they're running with thin liquidity and zero reserves. It's a structural vulnerability, comparable to a firm that keeps rolling short-term debt instead of refinancing long-term liabilities. Eventually, one missed renewal triggers insolvency, and the trust costs compound faster than the financial ones. Each shutdown undermines the perception that the federal government meets its obligations. That perception creditworthiness is the bedrock for global capital markets. Even if the Treasury continues servicing bonds during a shutdown, investors start pricing in a political risk premium, a small but measurable increase in yields to compensate for management dysfunction. In other words, the world starts charging the U.S. more to borrow because domestic politics look unreliable. The pattern mirrors emerging market behavior, where governance volatility translates directly into financing costs. Investors remember the 2011 debt ceiling standoff and 2013 shutdown. Both episodes raised Treasury yields temporarily and shook confidence in the dollar's predictability. The repetition of those events convinces global capital that American dysfunction isn't episodic, it's embedded. There's another problem baked into the structure. Because continuing resolutions maintain prior spending levels regardless of inflation or demographic change, they erode real funding over time. That means defense, healthcare, and social programs slowly lose capacity, even if nominal appropriations remain flat. It's silent austerity by drift, not decision. The absence of updated budgets becomes a slow bleed of institutional strength. Meanwhile, the policymaking rhythm collapses. Instead of setting multi-year priorities, investments in energy infrastructure, AI research, or public health, Congress spends months fighting over temporary renewals. That means missed innovation cycles and forfeited global competitiveness. The U.S. begins responding to crises after the fact rather than shaping them. From semiconductors to cyber defense, the delay costs compound in lost market share. Economically, this translates to lost potential output. When fiscal reliability drops, private investment recalibrates. Companies postpone large capital expenditures, knowing contracts and grants may freeze midstream. That's why political stagnation creates a self-fulfilling slowdown. Investors hesitate because the framework itself is volatile. On the fiscal side, every delay in passing a full budget adds to unfunded liabilities. Pension obligations, healthcare reimbursements, maintenance backlogs all accumulate interest-like costs. Treat those like debts, and each shutdown becomes a trigger that pushes government balance sheets deeper into negative territory. Structurally, this reduces the government's fiscal cushion, the margin it can rely on in recessionary cycles. All of this builds into a confidence spiral. The public begins to expect dysfunction. Agencies prepare for disruption instead of continuity. Private actors hedge against government uncertainty. Nothing collapses outright, but efficiency erodes. It's like corrosion in metal, invisible for years until a critical weld fails. That's the nature of structural decay. It's patient, cumulative, and almost impossible to reverse cheaply. The pressure eventually extends beyond Washington. State governments dependent on federal flows, Medicaid reimbursements, transportation funds, disaster relief, find themselves managing cash flow gaps when federal transfers pause. Credit analysts notice that dependency and state borrowing costs creep up too. The political stalemate at the national level thus radiates outward into local fiscal health. For investors, this isn't theoretical risk anymore. It's priced directly into yields and volatility indexes. The shutdown functions as a live stress test on U.S. political capacity. The results aren't encouraging. Each episode signals that consensus in budgeting, planning, and execution is eroding. That's how a temporary standoff turns into a permanent handicap on economic resilience. And while Washington stalls, the private sector absorbs the shock, but not evenly. When the shutdown drags from days into weeks, the immediate budget freeze evolves into a behavioral shock. Consumers start cutting back, businesses shift from expansion to defense, and investors look for safety rather than growth. What began as a political standoff becomes an ambient chill across industries. Confidence, not money, starts drying up first. And when confidence disappears, spending follows. Consumer psychology is fragile in periods of uncertainty. No, missing federal paychecks reduce disposable income for millions, and those families retrench instantly, canceling travel, delaying home purchases, skipping discretionary expenses. Even those untouched by the furloughs notice headlines about stalled parks, airports running thin on staff, or delayed refunds, and they subconsciously tighten budgets. Retail data during previous shutdowns showed measurable drops in weekend sales, even in unaffected regions. The effect isn't panic, it's hesitation. People wait, and waiting on a national scale is economic contraction in slow motion. For businesses, the damage spreads through delayed payments. Federal contractors are among the first to feel it. Payments for completed work freeze, invoices pile up, and bridge financing runs thin. A defense supplier awaiting quarterly reimbursements must draw on credit to pay workers and suppliers. Interest costs mount, margins shrink, and hiring plans evaporate. The same hit lands on construction firms dependent on federal infrastructure projects, roads, flood controls, research facilities. When Congress disputes a budget, heavy machinery sits idle, yet loans still need servicing. Each paused week destabilizes entire supply chains built on predictable payment cycles. State programs tethered to federal transfers experience similar stress. Medicaid reimbursements, highway funds, and education grants often require ongoing deposits from Washington. When that stream pauses, governors dip into reserves or issue short-term debt. Not every state has the same fiscal cushion, and credit agencies pay attention. In the 2019 shutdown, for example, several states saw borrowing costs edge higher as investors priced in cash flow risk. That same dynamic returns each time. Political paralysis interrupts transfer payments. Local governments then delay community-level projects, repairing water systems, upgrading schools, extending broadband, because they can't guarantee reimbursement. Federal dysfunction metastasizes downward. The irony is that shutdowns are sometimes sold as cost-saving measures. In reality, they amplify inefficiency. Agencies spend weeks ramping down, archiving incomplete tasks, and later spend weeks restarting, verifying systems, reconciling accounts. Contractors renegotiate schedules and fees to cover downtime. This stop-start rhythm wastes more in administrative friction than it ever saves in temporary payroll suspensions. The Government Accountability Office has repeatedly documented how shutdowns increase total expenditures once the hidden costs interest on delayed payments, lost fee collections, overtime to restart operations are accounted for. Economically, it's like turning an assembly line off and on every few days. You spend more energy recovering momentum than producing output. To picture this clearly, think of the economy as an engine. It runs on trust, timing, and consistent fuel flow. A shutdown isn't just removing pressure, it's cutting the ignition intermittently. The pistons still move, but power output collapses. Heat and efficiency leak away while the structure vibrates from inconsistent thrust. Restarting the engine requires bursts of extra fuel fiscal stimulus, catch-up spending, overtime labor to regain speed. Each iteration shortens the lifespan of the machine. Now, consider a small manufacturing company supplying precision parts to federal labs and defense contractors. By mid-quarter, half its purchase orders are frozen because the contracting officers are furloughed. Cash flow forecasts collapse overnight. The company taps its credit line to meet payroll, but lenders raise interest rates, anticipating delays in receivables. To conserve liquidity, management cuts shifts, defers equipment maintenance, and cancels new hiring. The next quarter's productivity falls, not from lack of demand, but from financial paralysis originating in Washington. Multiply that scenario across thousands of small suppliers, and you see how a bureaucratic freeze becomes a private sector slowdown. The geographic distribution of federal exposure amplifies this unevenly. The Washington, Virginia, Maryland corridor feels the sharpest hit because nearly 1 in 4 workers there depends directly or indirectly on federal spending. Tourist regions from national park towns in Utah and Arizona to coastal research hubs in Massachusetts see local incomes crater as visitors disappear and public projects halt. In New Mexico, where defense and energy laboratories drive high-skill employment, the ripple threatens specialized supply chains. These aren't abstract effects on GDP. They're structural blows to regional stability. When paychecks stop in concentrated areas, housing markets soften, service businesses cut hours, and state tax receipts shrink. The drag outlasts the shutdown itself, because recovery for small enterprises occurs slower than the resumption of federal operations. Meanwhile, credibility abroad takes a quieter hit. International investors and foreign governments watch the pattern of repeated shutdowns and see governance dysfunction hardening into normality. For them, the question shifts from will the U.S. default to can Washington maintain institutional reliability? That change in framing matters. The U.S. dollar's dominance rests on predictability. The idea that political drama never interferes with basic operations of government. Each shutdown scratches that reputation. Even if bondholders remain paid, the sense of disorder nudges central banks to diversify reserves incrementally away from U.S. assets. Those shifts happen slowly, but they accumulate. A basis point higher yield or a slightly weaker bid for Treasury signals confidence erosion. That is the international echo of domestic paralysis. Markets respond accordingly. Equity volatility ticks upward, credit spreads widen, and corporate executives postpone investment until clarity returns. That caution can easily trim annual growth by 0.5 percentage point, a meaningful loss in a mature economy. Yet the more worrying aspect is behavioral habituation. Businesses begin budgeting for dysfunction, setting aside shutdown reserves the same way they handle interest rate risk. Once crisis planning becomes routine, inefficiency embeds itself into strategy. The longer this pattern persists, the more it alters structural dynamics. Innovation slows because research programs stall unpredictably. Infrastructure modernization lags because procurement pauses reset timelines. Labor productivity weakens as skilled contractors exit federal supply chains altogether, unwilling to tolerate income variance tied to politics. Even when clarity returns, talent doesn't immediately come back. That attrition leaves permanent scars in institutional knowledge and private sector capacity. By this stage of the shutdown, you can feel the rhythm of stasis: consumers waiting, firms conserving, investors hedging. The political fight in Washington has mutated into an economic quiet zone across the country. Production still occurs, but without conviction. Spending happens, but with caution. And growth resumes only when confidence outweighs memory of instability. But even when this shutdown ends, the deeper problem doesn't. The danger of repeating shutdowns isn't just fiscal, it's psychological. Once markets and citizens start treating political paralysis as inevitable, dysfunction becomes an input into economic planning. Every future budget, contract, or investment begins with a silent assumption: the government might fail to act. That expectation alone weakens performance, even in stable stretches. For investors, normalization means recalibrating risk permanently higher. Treasury bonds, once viewed as the ultimate safe asset, start carrying a political risk premium. Each recurring standoff leaves a residue of caution, and that pushes borrowing costs upward. Even a few basis points across trillions in debt issuance translate into billions in extra annual interest. Those are real dollars lost, not to productive projects or public goods, but to compensate markets for uncertainty about governance itself. It's the structural version of paying more for the same protection because the guard refuses to stay awake. Businesses internalize the same pessimism. Executives set cash buffers to weather potential shutdowns, diverting funds from research and hiring. Instead of chasing opportunity, they plan around paralysis. That produces lower productivity growth, the exact opposite of what long-term competitiveness requires. Over time, the U.S. economy develops a drag coefficient, an invisible friction that taxes every transaction with uncertainty. Politically, short-term tactics crowd out long-term vision. Lawmakers test which crises move polling numbers rather than which policies build stability. The practice of using stopgap resolutions as leverage calcifies inefficiency into habit. That's not just a procedural flaw, it's an erosion of institutional credibility. When compromise disappears from budgeting, negotiation becomes theater, and the consequence is delayed progress across everything from infrastructure to climate adaptation. Globally, investors pay close attention to these patterns. Repetition signals trend. As shutdowns become cyclic, the perception of U.S. fiscal management shifts from reliable but divided to politically brittle. Central banks diversify reserves, multinational corporations hedge geographically, and emerging economies sense space to challenge dollar dominance. Trust, once America's cheapest strategic asset, begins to cost more to sustain. Each episode of paralysis adds another crack to that trust. The impact compounds when demographics and entitlement spending tighten fiscal space. As the population ages, mandatory programs like Social Security and Medicare claim a larger share of the budget, leaving less flexibility for everything else. Combine that with higher interest costs on federal debt, and the government's fiscal cushion thins. That reduces its ability to respond to recession, disaster, or conflict. In macroeconomic terms, political dysfunction translates directly into lower resilience during crises. There's an irony here. Shutdowns are often justified as enforcing discipline, forcing government to live within its means. But when they become routine, they do the opposite. They degrade systems faster than they restrain spending. Every restart requires overtime pay, contingency planning, legal settlements, and administrative cleanup. It's like slamming the brakes on a moving truck every quarter just to prove you can stop. Eventually, the transmission fails. The pattern isn't austerity, it's self-inflicted inefficiency. If this repetition continues, innovation and public investment will remain perpetually behind demand. Infrastructure projects will stay half-funded, research initiatives half-executed, and agencies half-staffed. The world won't wait for Washington's internal reconciliations. Capital will flow toward predictability elsewhere. And the U.S. advantage in scale and stability will erode step by step. If you want to see the lasting economic damage, look beyond today's missed paychecks. The deeper cost is systemic fatigue, a nation adjusting to dysfunction as the default rather than the exception. That normalization is what corrodes strength from within. The real cost of a shutdown isn't the immediate GDP loss or the delayed pay cycle. It's the gradual decay of institutional reliability that supports all economic activity. A government that lurches from crisis to crisis imports that volatility into every market it touches. Over time, that erodes productivity, investor confidence, and the fiscal breathing room needed to manage future shocks. Fiscal paralysis has become a standing economic vulnerability. Politics once served as a stabilizing force for business. Now, it's the primary source of unpredictability. Structural resilience can't thrive in permanent uncertainty. Investors, states, and workers all feel the same gravity pulling down efficiency. Watch the indicators that reveal true economic strength: fiscal reserves, credit spreads, and confidence in governance. Those numbers tell you more about future growth than any headline negotiation. Use this analysis to inform your next move. We'll be back with the next phase, how recovery unfolds, and what the debt markets reveal once the lights turn back on.